Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Again, good evening and welcome here. Those in the balcony seats over there. Those who are visiting and joining us from via live stream. We are, of course, celebrating Leah Reesor-Keller's new book, Tending Tomorrow, and Courageous Change for People and Planet. I'm grateful that you're here, Leah, from Ontario. You've invited Moses Falco and Sandy Plett as guest panelists and conversationalists for this evening. Welcome here as well. I'll make brief introductions in a short bit. I'll just introduce myself first. My name is Arlen. I'm the director at Common Word, the bookstore and resource center of Mennonite Church Canada and CMU, Canadian Mennonite University, where it's possible to buy or borrow or access resources online. It is our privilege to be hosting this conversation, and a conversation about meaning making, or what would be really the root of religion, the work of religion, and as Leah outlines it, of redreaming, retelling, renewing, reimagining, and rewilding inherited traditions to faithfully meet the changing context of our time. So tonight's conversation, I trust, will be one of hope and liberation in our present context of struggle, change, longing, complexity, even peril. Forecasting the future, we know we need courageous change for ourselves and our planet. And how do we best practice leadership in the church and elsewhere in these moments? And how do we, in the words of the book, courageously tend tomorrow? One reminder that can propel us toward a sustainable and equitable future is acknowledging that we here in Winnipeg live as treaty people in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Ojibwe Cree nations. We gather in Treaty 1 territory, benefit daily from Treaty 3 water, Treaty 5 hydroelectricity. And those of you on live stream may be joining us from other sacred lands. We make this acknowledgement in respect for the host peoples who have and continue to love and care for the land, and we recommit ourselves to real change that fosters reconciliation. A couple of quick notes. For those who are participating online, we would love to hear from you. Send a brief chat message if you'd like with your name and location so we have a sense of who is joining us. This conversation is live streamed and recorded and will be kept online at commonword.ca for future viewers. After the conversation up here, there will be time for question and answers among all of us. And online viewers can submit their questions via the chat function if you would like, and I will monitor that. And after the formal part of the evening, Tending Tomorrow will be available to purchase in person at Common Word or online at commonword.ca. I will include a link to the book in the chat. Now, let me take a few moments to introduce our three guests. Leah Reesor-Keller, author, of course, of tonight's featured book, is a speaker, writer, and leadership consultant who helps churches and nonprofits set vision and strategy for transformational change. She has nearly 20 years' experience working with faith-based and social justice organizations in Canada, Haiti, Jamaica, and Nepal. She lives with her partner and children in Kitchener, Ontario. Sandy Plett is the Climate Action Coordinator for Mennonite Church Canada. In response to the climate crisis, Sandy provides support to our regional churches and their working groups. She also networks with nationwide partners doing climate justice work. And together with her partner and children, she lives in Morden, Manitoba. Moses Falco has been pastor at Sterling Mennonite Fellowship here in Winnipeg since 2015. Graduated from CMU after studying communications, media, and theology. His communication interests have led him to dovetail pastoral work with graphic design, blogging, and podcasting. He lives in Winnipeg with his partner and children. Welcome to each of you. Welcome to everyone. I'll invite you forward.
We're already discussing, well, who's going to be the center of this show? And
Should be
we've decreed that it's Moses. But good evening, everyone. And it's really nice to see some familiar faces here, as well as some that I don't know. And I can't see those of you online or listening later, but I know from folks who have reached out to me that there are people watching from different provinces and different parts of Canada, and glad that you are joining us. Also maybe outside of Canada, because the internet is transnational. But thank you all for joining me here tonight. What I want to start with is thinking a little bit about what led me to write Tending Tomorrow. Because on the face of it, it's a book about climate change, and it's a book about how are we going to live in this world, especially for myself. I'll be turning 39 this year and thinking about decades ahead and what that will look like, thinking about my children and the world that they'll be inheriting, and thinking like we are here living in this world, and what will that look like? What resources can we draw on from our faith tradition, and what are we going to need to reimagine? Because what has got us here is not going to be what takes us forward. We know there needs to be some very radical and dramatic changes, and that faith communities, the church, and for myself, my own Anabaptist faith tradition, have a lot of resources to offer us too, to imagine this future. But one of the things that it comes down to for me is thinking, actually, how are we going to work together in communities? How are we going to inhabit leadership differently? Because in the context of the climate crisis, it's not that there aren't solutions. There are many solutions, and we know many technical ideas are out there. And a lot of this comes down to leadership. How are we going to work together? How are we going to make decisions? And so the conversation tonight, I was really happy that Moses and Sandy accepted my invitation to do some thinking, some reimagining about what might it look like to come together differently in our churches, in our community organizations, to inhabit how it is that we make decisions, whose voices are heard, what it is that we expect of leaders, who can be a leader, and to think about what that might look like. How can we move forward in a way that is interdependent and interconnected? And so I'm going to stop there for now. And the format tonight, I would really like this to be discussion-based. So you'll hear us talking with each other in conversation, and then later talking with you in conversation as well, because I think that is where the real magic happens, is what happens between us from the different voices and perspectives. So I'm going to start with Moses, who is unfortunately for him beside me here in the center. And just ask you to share, Moses, what some of your experiences and thoughts about leadership.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, and good evening. It's nice to be here with you all. I was at Common Word. Shout out to Common Word. I go there every so often and pick up some books. And I was there a few months ago, and I saw this book on the shelf, and I'm like, oh, I know who Leah is. Like, I've had some email exchanges. I've seen the work that she's done at Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. And then I looked through it a bit. I'm like, this is a really important book, a conversation not only about climate change, but leadership and the church and how it's all intertangled and the future. And as someone who still likes to think of himself as a young person, thinking about the future and having felt quite hopeless, of not even knowing how to engage the topics of what kind of world is there going to be for my 2 and 4-year-old? In some ways, I felt paralyzed about that. So anyways, I picked up the book wanting to read it. And then a few weeks later, got an email from Leah asking me if I'd want to be on this panel. And I thought, what? I'm flattered, but why me? This doesn't make any sense. And then I started to explain a bit of where I might be coming from with this. And we thought it might be a natural fit. And what I wanted to share, just to get the conversation going, is some of the harder experiences that I've had in leadership and in the church, and especially in the last year. And it's not something that I've kind of come out and really talked about as much. But it might sound a little bit funny, but when I started pastoring in a Mennonite church here in Winnipeg in 2015, everyone told me that I needed to be careful because we had a history of burning out our pastors. We had a history of becoming too dependent on our pastors because as soon as we had a pastor in that leadership role, we felt like we could just push more and more on them, and they never knew when to say no. And so I thought, yeah, sure, I'll be careful. Yeah, for sure. That's not going to happen to me because, I'm a team player. We're in a Mennonite church where everything is supposed to be flat and we're a priesthood of all believers. And then last year, I burnt out. And the way I might describe it more truthfully is to say that I was on the verge of burning out. And I realized that the same things that our church had been doing for so long had happened to me. And it wasn't just the church's fault. I don't blame the church. I think that for myself, I put so much on myself and didn't know a different way of viewing leadership. In this book, Leah talks about leadership in a way that's decentralized, where people share with each other and where it's not just about one hero figure who takes us to the promised land. And yet, that's kind of what I thought I was. And in the end, when it really came down to me burning out, there were things that I didn't know how to let go of anymore. And I believed that it would fall apart if I wasn't there. And that was an issue. And the church recognized it, and my wife recognized it before I recognized it, and realized we have to do something differently. And they said, you're going on a leave. And I said, yeah, I probably need a bit of time away to rethink this stuff. Maybe give me 2 weeks. And they said, no, you're getting 3 months. 2 weeks is not enough. But it wasn't just for my sake. It wasn't for my health. It was for my health, for my family's health, and the health of the community. Because we realized as a church that we had lost something about what it meant to be community and how to do things together and how to view leadership. And so I took that time off, and I could, of course, share much more about it. But it was after that experience that I picked up this book, and I'm like, yes, I need to reimagine this. I need to reimagine how we do this. And so anyways, if we can dig more into that in our conversation. But one thing I did want to share, in Leah's book, she writes about leadership and this idea, well, you got to pick up the book to find out. No, I'm just kidding. But that everything is interconnected and interdependent. And she describes the leader as someone who takes responsibility for sharing information and resources to benefit the whole. A leader is part of a network of leaders, some visible and some invisible, all working to nourish, repair, heal, and share across the fabric of the community. And so when I apply that view of a leader and leadership into the local congregation, this allows me to reimagine what leadership can look like, to look a little bit different. And the piece that really stood out to me is leader is someone who takes responsibility for sharing information and resources to benefit the whole. And again, in my context, I see that as the pulpit. And who gets to stand at the pulpit? Who gets to hold the microphone and share that information with the people? Usually, it's those who have the power, right? Usually, it's those who are seen as the leader. And one of the things that I've been trying to encourage our congregation to look at is to share that place of speaking and that place of power, and to share it in a way that we allow ourselves to hear the voices of people that we would never otherwise hear, and that may even require us to do more work to be able to hear them. But in doing so, we're able to share that role of information sharing and resource sharing and hear from people that we might otherwise not see as having those leadership qualities. So anyway, if we want to pick at any of that, I'd love to talk more about it.
Well, that's a really good segue. But thank you, Moses. And I'm glad that you read that passage, because for me, like, I felt very inspired in thinking about leadership and understanding that trees in a forest are interconnected through their roots and through the mycelium networks that share information, and that trees can talk to each other and support the thriving of the whole in this decentralized way. And as I was thinking, well, who is doing this? Where is this happening? One place I thought about is, Sandy, is your role in connecting across Mennonite Church Canada. So take it away.
Nice, thank you. Well, also it's very nice to be here. I loved one of my favorite things about reading this book was that the authors Leah was referring to were books that I had just read, wanted to read, or like were somewhere, and I was like, yay, this is so good. I think there's another person who's thinking in similar ways and taking some of those things I have thought about to new levels. So Suzanne Simard's book about the trees, I had read it, and I was like, yes, this totally makes sense. So, and interestingly, well, one of the questions Leah asked is how am I reimagining or practicing this decentralized leadership? And so the first thought I had was, well, am I? And so I just thought about what some of the reflections some reflecting on the last not quite 2 years with Mennonite Church Canada. And early on, I realized my task was, the structure of my task kind of lends itself well to decentralized leadership, because I have to relate to people across the country and try to uphold their work. So my efforts are upholding the work of the regional working groups on climate. So it's not what I want to have happen that's at the center of the work, but what those groups want to have happen. And so that is decentralized. And also, I've been encouraged to look for the common threads, like what are the themes coming up across, like all the way from BC to Eastern Canada, what are the common threads that people want to see happen or are concerned about? And I've been trying to pick those out. And so I think of these mycelial networks, and like those are threads too. Like what are the strong threads? What are the places where many people are wondering about the same thing, and how can we address that and help people to know that they're not alone in those concerns? So one such thread, for example, was there was curiosity when I started my work from each region was like, what are the churches saying about the climate crisis? How are they responding? And because all of the regions were curious about this, in my little spot in the network, I was able to say, hey, everybody wants to know about this. What can we do? And so we put together this environmental sustainability survey and have a report on that. So in a way, just creating space around that thread of curiosity allowed us to get to a next space. So I kind of think about it like trying to lift up the voices from across the country so people can hear each other. And another example that I think fits this description is we just recently had an event where we gathered the regional leaders on working, the climate action working groups, creation care working groups, and the Indigenous relations working groups, just to let them spend time together and get to know each other. And out of that event, there was such a buzz. Like I remember Marta was there. We were sitting in the room listening, and people were really talking to each other. And it was no longer about input from myself and Jonathan, who were leading, but what was happening in the conversations around the room. So I guess that is happening. It's hard to do with the long distances across the country. And so I'm always looking for how can we raise up other voices. You also asked what led us to do this, and I'll share one story, and this maybe is like, maybe it's a good example of how to be a mushroom, but when I started this work, I was invited to have lunch with a young woman, Annika Rayner, who's very educated and is studying PhD, I think. And I was really intimidated, so I said to my partner, I'm having lunch with Annika today, and I feel like I'm just going to sound really dumb. And he's like, it doesn't actually matter what you know. Your job is to meet the people who know stuff and help them to find the other people that they need to talk to in order to move the work along. And I was like, oh, actually, that takes a lot of pressure off, and I like that. So I can learn from everybody that I meet and say, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. And then in your book, you quote Paul Lederach. I don't know how you say it.
John Paul Lederach.
Thank
John
you.
Paul Lederach.
Thank you. Finding out who needs to be connected to whom. And I feel like that's, if anything, that's my most important role working for the church right now. And like Moses, I resonate. I've learned over the years that I get burned out and stressed if I think the responsibility of big decisions is all on me. And we just need a lot of shoulders to hold that. I guess one of the challenges trying to figure out how to lead. Like, there are people calling me to take leadership on certain issues, how to lead without being, how to lead in a way that is decentralized or collaborative or shares the voice. And also sometimes I struggle with knowing what direction to lead because the community says a lot of different things. So that's a challenge. And another challenge I feel is the challenge of with a network sort of leadership model, we need a lot of different people to step up and say, I'll do that. And I think that's hard. I feel like we've all disclosed our age. I'm 47, and I feel like in my adult life, I see more and more that in circles where I don't want to be on committees. When I became a young adult and I started being committee age, I was like, no thanks. I don't want to be on any committees, and I still feel that way. But I see we need inspiring reasons for people to get involved, and sitting around and talking isn't always inspiring. But I also see people that I work with of all ages just really hesitant to take on the bottom line role. Like, I'll help with that project, but I'm not going to be in charge. And so sometimes I think we need to figure out how to get more instigators, or how to spark more courage. I don't know. So the theme of courage is I think it's really pertinent, because this model we're talking about needs way more of us to do a bit less, but to do it courageously, I think. That's some of my thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Sandy. It brings to mind two of the pressures that I think affect what are we being told? What is this dominant narrative of, like, who is a leader and what does a leader do and what do we expect of leaders? And so one aspect of our culture is wanting leaders to be champions and to be, okay, this is our person and they're going to do that, and I'm cheering on, my person or this person. It's the epitome of the poster child. We see it across our political sphere right now, where it becomes less like, well, let's talk about the merits of this idea or this policy, and it's more like, well, are you on this team or that team? Do you like this person or do you not like this person? And I think that trickles down into, well, certainly for pastors, for others in leadership positions, looking beyond churches, our leaders in community organizations and nonprofits, are also burning out at high rates. Like, that's really common across the sector, because I think that pressure to be the hero, to be the champion, that people want you to do that, or they're disillusioned that you aren't, intersects with a really high emphasis on perfectionism in our Western culture. And certainly, my own Mennonite upbringing, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Anybody heard that before?
No pressure.
It's like, where does my perfectionist streak come from? God. Sorry. Not, and it matters. We want to strive for excellence, but it also is something, and I have some of the statistics that I, looked into the research on, is rising levels of perfectionism, measured by psychologists of how people, the standards they set for themselves and the standards that they hold others to. It's like we expect a lot from each other, and we have less grace when people don't live up to that. But that's impossible to sustain leadership in this environment when you can't meet your own expectations, but also you're not meeting others' expectations, and they're telling you that. And so there's something around here of like, we have to find ways, one, to share ownership, to be willing to take ownership and understand, to make it safe for people to take on responsibility for a project and, not worry about ultimately being accountable for it, to make it safe to do that, to let people be messy and imperfect, and to be continually calling each other to higher standards of relationship and of moving forward together and of thinking about what leads to the flourishing of the whole. And it's hard because in our society, even in our churches, where, as you said, Moses, we care about, priesthood of all believers and being this more flat structure, we know that the same, or maybe not the same, but that there are power dynamics at play of like who is listened to more easily, who is seen as someone who is a leader and thus worth listening to, and who is held to different standards or is more quick to get the criticism or that feedback, and who's allowed to be messy or imperfect. When I became executive minister of MCEC, I talked to some other people who were leaders, people who I knew in other leadership roles, and some of the most common advice that I got was, just be vulnerable with folks, just be real, like, you're not perfect, you're struggling too, you're all learning together. But when an older white man in that role is vulnerable and shares, people are like, oh, wow, he's so open, it's just really authentic. But then when a younger woman who doesn't have that same level of trust, shares openly, like, yeah, I'm learning as I go, I'm not going to get it all right, I'm figuring it out. People are like, oh, yep, yeah, we know you are not getting it right. And so that same, that leadership advice that, I think we should all be open and we want to hold that space for each other, right? I also don't think it's healthy for us to claim to have it all together, if we don't. But recognizing that we just have different expectations for each other. So how are we going to make that space for everyone to recognize no one person is going to have it all, and actually we need each other?
I think that it just reminds me, in my experience, of the importance of the community's work to try to define how we view these leaders and the expectations we have on them. And for me, it was actually a blessing to be able to be in a community that was as gracious as they were. And I know not everyone has that kind of experience. I know that many people burn out and can't possibly see themselves back in that same role, in that same community, and they're just kind of done. But to have a chance to be able to talk about these things and be able to normalize, just the different struggles we have, whether it's, physical or mental health or, stresses and anxieties and all of that. I was grateful for the community's work. And so maybe a question for you, like, as we are spread out into wide communities and varying communities trying to do all this really good work, whether it is climate action or it is something else. What do you see as the community's role in helping to shape and define a culture where it's kind of known what the expectations are of each other, and where healthy expectations can grow up rather than these high, unachievable expectations?
One of the things that I think about a lot is this idea of culture, the values, the expectations we have for each other. And the thing about culture is you can only shape it together with others. Like, one person can't build a culture, right? Like, you can't weave a tapestry with one thread. It's how it all comes together. And I think that there is an immense power in congregations, in denominations, in organizations, where it's like people coming together to say, okay, what do we want to be normal here? Teachers in a classroom is an example I think of a lot, and pastors certainly have this power too of like, well, what is going to be normal here? How are we going to treat each other? How are we going to set these standards of whether that's, like you gave a great example of seeing the pulpit as a place that there should be many different voices and perspectives heard from that, and making that normal in your context. Because, one person can't do it alone. Like, it's going to take that commitment. But the power of churches, of congregations and organizations, is that you can do that. And I think going back to this larger context of the climate crisis, faith communities are a really powerful place to say, no, this is how we understand ourselves to be in the world, to be in God's world, and this is how we understand our responsibility to live into that. Churches, despite all of the, complications and accountabilities in the world we live in, churches still have the power of moral authority. And we build that up and say, our values call us to live like this, and let's put that into practice. And that, for me, that's a big part of why I continue to be part of a congregation. I'm a member and on the elders team at Erb Street Mennonite Church in Waterloo. And it's saying, I want to be in a place with others where we are together saying we want to show up differently in the world. And we'll come together to do that. Not having all the answers, but being with people who also care about that.
Sandy has all the answers.
No. I did actually think of some words, and maybe these are not answers, but one of the questions, see, Moses and I are different. I came with 2 pages of notes. He's like, huh. He gave me a funny look.
No,
but it wasn't a funny look. It was a funny look. I was thinking about what are the challenges of trying to embody leadership differently, and I thought part of it is how we name our work. Like I love what you're saying, Leah, about just demonstrating that. I mean, it's cliche, be the change you want to see, but really, like, do it differently, and practice that in whatever small circles, like whether it's at home or wherever. And I think, like, my involvement with the Climate Action Working Group here in Manitoba, we always talk about being church together. We are a committee, and I've actually shed my hatred of committees because, apologies to those who are on committees with me 20 years ago, but I feel like the groups that I work with, there's a stronger effort to be church together when we're gathering to do our work. And that just changes it completely. These are now my family that I'm working with, my church family, and we're working at things that we care about. So embodying that, I don't know, churchliness is the word, I guess. But I was thinking about my job as coordinator, climate action coordinator. I'm not the climate action boss or director, I'm the coordinator, which implies many moving parts and sort of an orchestration. So when I started the job, I thought, I guess I need to kind of disappear. And as I've worked at it, I'm like, I shouldn't disappear. I need to be here, but somehow we all need to appear. And so other words, as I thought about this today, that I thought of were coordinator, convener. A convener is someone who brings people and voices together. Upholder is another word, encourager. Maybe the encourager is who supplies nutrients to the network. Space protector, somebody who, make sure that when people are together, they're following healthy practices that allow them to see and hear each other. Another word was inviter and welcomer. So these are all, they're not boss words, but they are critical leadership words, I think, when we start to think about how we work in this collaborative way.
I really like your word, Sandy. Somehow we all need to appear, and that it's not about, the goal isn't to be invisible. The goal is that leadership shows up in its many forms, and that's recognized. And this is like not new. So one of the pieces that I put in the book is, so one of my new favorite Bible passages is Romans 16, 1-16, which you can look it up. But it mentions 28 people, male and female, that Paul names as co-workers. And he describes the different ways that they, build up and support this movement. And that includes all kinds of roles. Like some people are offering their homes, and one person is named as like mothering and really providing that support for people who are risking their lives and being imprisoned through their preaching. And I just thought it was a really beautiful example, because often how I've read the Bible or come to understand it, it's about the heroes, right? It's Daniel in the lions, or even it's Paul, the amazing apostle and teacher. But when you look at this, it's like actually it's many people who are showing up with leadership in different ways, and that coming together is what makes it all possible.
If I could shift us a little bit, if that's okay. One of the really inspiring parts of this book was when you were retelling stories, and when you were giving the account of your own story. And so this kind of sharing a bit, but also then a question. So Leah goes through her kind of family story and ancestry of how they landed in Southern Ontario, and some of the stories that she was told growing up, and then later doing research and finding out that it might have been different, or it was different than what she was told. And so I don't know if you want to get into that piece, but I just found it really... I mean, again, something that's like, it's kind of obvious that the stories we tell ourselves will lead us into certain kind of being, a certain kind of community shaping, responsibility taking, and then action, right? And so that it's so important. What are the stories we are telling ourselves? And so maybe you want to say a little bit about that, but then also, I loved your story, but I also have a very different story of parents who are first generation, and being the first in my, me and my siblings being the first to be born in Canada. And yet it's so important about how we are telling our stories in our connection as treaty people, as citizens of this country, as our role in, the climate crisis and all of that. So I don't know, I'd love to hear a bit more from you on that.
Well, I think you're right that stories are crucial, and the whole first two chapters of the book are about, for me, retelling my family ancestry story of, so I'm a descendant of, I would say my ethnic origins are Swiss Mennonite, even as my faith is Anabaptist Mennonite in this larger global faith tradition. So for my ancestors, understanding how they understood themselves, and then now looking at what I know about how they came to Ontario from Pennsylvania, ways that the land that they had access to, is Indigenous land. And I didn't know that until recently, or not that I didn't know that, but that's not part of telling the story of my family. You know, the story of my family is like upstanding pioneer farmers who feed the world and are missionaries and do, you know, all these good upstanding things. And so then as I'm learning more and, you know, have this sense of scales falling from my eyes, of thinking like, oh, actually this is something that really changed how I think about my heritage, is I heard, and now I can't remember where I heard this, is that these Swiss Mennonites in Pennsylvania were seen as ideal settlers for enacting settler colonialism because they're pacifists. They're not going to have violent uprisings against the colonists, and they're really good farmers. So they'll feed, you know, the cities, the armies, the growing workforce. And yet for me, I've really valued that I come from, you know, a lineage of pacifism, of choosing nonviolence, of that being baked in. And so I never really thought about ways that has been implicated in situations of harm. And so it's been a journey for me of like, okay, well, what is it that I honor about my ancestors and want to take with me? And what are the things that I want to say, like, oh, I understand that differently now. I need to tell that differently. But in a bigger lens, or going back to the leadership question, storytelling becomes one of the most important leadership skills, because it's about creating this vision and bringing people into it. Who are we? Who are we together? How did we get here, and where are we going? And those are the skills of saying what matters to us and how do we belong. And Moses, just thinking about your comment about being first generation in Canada, and I don't know how many generations of your family have been part of the Mennonite family of faith, but how we talk about the Mennonite and the Anabaptist story, the story that we tell about that really shapes like who belongs, who has a voice, how do those power things work, right? Nobody ever questions my right to belong within the Mennonite world, because one of my names is like, oh yeah, well, that can be traced back to Switzerland. But that says nothing about, you know, what is my current faith or practice, or how that connects into the global body. And so it's really important that we think about the stories we tell and how that reinforces who we are as a people.
It's funny how, you know, I married someone who grew up in the Mennonite church and who has a bit more of that family history. And it's funny how much I lean on it sometimes in certain contexts, because I know if I drop the name of my in-laws, parents and grandparents, then I'm in, you know, because I am the first one and only one of my family who would call themselves a Mennonite. But I think that chapter, or those chapters, did inspire me. Like, how are we telling our story? And my hope for the Mennonite church is that we start to maybe reimagine and retell our story in a way that's more authentic to who we are today, and our experiences, and the global context that we're in as well. And that through the retelling of those stories, I find hope, right? That we might be able to capture a more authentic and healthy culture that might move us into more positive spaces. So I appreciated that part of your book a lot.
And it was actually the first piece that I wrote for the book that ends up as the epilogue, is a letter to my daughter Ava. She will turn 6 in a couple weeks. But of thinking, well, what is the story that I want to pass down to her? And what is the wisdom that I want her to take with her? And what is the knowledge of who she is and where she comes from that will also hopefully support her to see herself as part of a network of leaders and be able to enact change, and to do that from a grounded way, knowing that I don't know what that future will look like, but I imagine she will be facing a lot of challenges in her life. Sandy, do you have thoughts?
I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
Arlen might have online questions. Should we?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So questions and also comments. If you have something to add to the conversation, would be really welcome too.
And Arlen's moving the mic there because you can use that mic.
Yes, we will
Okay.
use this mic, and I can pass it to you. I just wanted to mention a comment from our online visitors. Mark Bigland Pritchard writes about an Alan Hirsch book called The Forgotten Ways, where Alan calls for a return to the Ephesians 4 model of leadership as a collaborative partnership among apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And he also translates that into what Mark says business speak, like entrepreneurs, questioners, communicators, humanizers, and instructors. He's suggesting that this isn't how we are doing church typically, nor for that matter the climate justice movement at present. But to me, Mark says it makes total sense. He's open to conversation about that Ephesians 4 list.
Yeah, well, thanks for that comment. I think like the Romans list, which is another way to list what are some of the different attributes or skills that a movement needs. I think whatever the language, what matters is that we understand people are different and they have different gifts, and all of those gifts are valued and needed. And how people embody that leadership looks really different too, but that we need each other, and that as we think of like, well, who can be a leader and who can show up here, that we don't have just one archetype in our mind, but that we're thinking of it as we need all kinds of people to do this, right? We need the bigger and broader coalitions, and as you have called us into, Sandy, like we need the doers too, who are like, well, let's get this done. I can make this piece happen.
Yeah, I love that idea of, I love the idea of broadening the invitation, like as broad as we can possibly make it to the church, but in my work to the climate movement, like we need every hand on the job. We need, however you want to envision it, we need all the gifts. And so the only way that some gifts are going to show up is if they know they're going to be safe and honored to bring their gifts. And so I think that somehow is our job as leaders who are like hired leaders or paid leaders or recognized leaders to always be inviting others and asking that question, what voice needs to be heard, who needs to be at the table, and who needs to meet who? Like my favorite meeting is a meeting where when it's over, everyone is talking to other people who were at the meeting, and I'm just sitting there by myself or cleaning up the chairs. That's a good meeting.
Yes. And you said safety. You talked about what gifts do people feel safe to bring their gifts, and are their gifts welcome when they bring them? We can't take that for granted. That's really important to be building that safety.
But why is it that the hero model is so alluring? During my time away, my stress leave, I had the chance to visit a whole bunch of different churches, and I went to a different church every Sunday. And I went to some beautiful, small churches where I could just sense a lovely community feel and had wonderfully meaningful worship. And then I went to one church. I won't name the church, but it's one of the biggest churches in Winnipeg. And you could not turn a corner in that church without seeing the picture of the pastor's face. You knew this was this pastor's church. You knew who was in charge. And the place was packed, right? The place was full. And there was energy and there was money. And looking at the political scene too, it's like the hero model is so enticing, right? But why is that? And why, when it crumbles, does it crumble so hard?
Well, they're probably interconnected there. But there is something that's really nice because it doesn't ask much of you, right? There's a consumerness to it of like, this person's got it, and it's going to be okay, that will be taken care of. Maybe ways in which your own identity gets linked into like, we all care about this, and this person exemplifies that, and it's going to be okay. I feel that myself too, of like, okay, if this, person, also I'm a dual citizen in the US, if this person just gets elected, it's all going to be fine. Or it's all going to go, and actually I saw some statistic related to the UN that was like, probably no matter who is elected in the US, how that affects, funding or participation in the UN might not be all that different, even as I think it will make a huge difference in the lives of many people. But it's really seductive to be like, problem solved, we'll get this done and then it'll be okay. And I think especially when leaders from underrepresented communities come into leadership roles, then they are holding so many hopes and dreams that like, now the moment has come, now this is the watershed, now everything is going to be different and we're all going to be fine. But actually, those are the times when it's important to lean in even more and make it so that it's not just that one person's job to shift everything, but that it's like, well, because it's going to be harder for them to do that. It's going to take bigger and broader coalitions and more trust and support. And I don't know. I looked at, also, I have a background in political science, and I'm currently the transitional executive director for Kairos, Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiative. So I interact a lot in the political sphere in that lobbying advocacy world. But there was a time when my own member of provincial parliament, Laura May Lindo, stepped back, and part of it was she couldn't earn enough on her salary to pay for childcare as a single mother for her to travel back and forth, right? She couldn't expense, or there was no funds for like a live-in nanny, which is what you need if you have to suddenly do a midnight vote, in another city. And Jacinta Ardern who was former Prime Minister of New Zealand, would be another female trailblazing leader that I've looked up to. And she also stepped back at a certain time of saying, like, it's too much. Not that that's too much, but that she was feeling burnout. I think she used those words, and stepped back. So I look at that and I say, well, we have these heroes, but what actually sustains people to be able to hold these roles?
Two things come to mind. First, that story in your chapter about Uprose, the community where it's led by everyone, and you just gave the example, if someone is sick or they're home with their kids who are sick, they can still vote. There's still a place for them in the structure, even if they have to step away. And I love the idea of you're not out of commission just because you're dealing with your familial responsibilities or personal health. The other thing I thought of as you were talking about why is it so seductive, this hero leadership, maybe it's partly because we want to have rest. And wouldn't it just be nice if someone else would take care of it? And maybe that speaks to a larger issue, which is that we've worked ourselves into such a frenzy of busyness and overcommitment that we really do need a hero to just take over. And so it's a deeper shift than just saying everybody get involved and it'll be fine. Because actually for a lot of people it won't be fine. They can't even get involved because they're already so overcommitted. Just taking my kid to volleyball, right?
Right, or working, right?
Yes.
You have to work a lot just to deal with the cost of living. So how is capitalism and inflation affecting people's ability to volunteer?
Yeah, so maybe there's a little bit of hope in that being pressured into changing the way we do things may actually help us to recognize some of those illnesses in the way that we have structured our society and the way we've bought in. We bought it.
Yeah, other questions from folks in the room or online?
Hi, Leah. My name is Marta Bunnett-Weeb. One of the questions I've been thinking about in the church, thinking about climate as a working group member with Sandy here in Manitoba, is the role of trust. And I think in the hero model of leadership, we put our trust in the leader, and then we don't have to think about anybody else. And when we think creatively and differently about leadership and action, suddenly we have to be around a table of people, or we need to be together as whole, consortiums of people to take action. And that means I have to trust another person that maybe I do know or I don't know. And so how do we do that? Because I wonder, do we trust each other with our deepest fears about the world? Whether that's about war or climate or our other concerns.
Thank you, Marta. I think that's a really insightful question, because trust, not just between family members or within a church community, but we actually need trust across the fabric of our community, across the fabric of our society. And right, I have to trust that my neighbor who is different than me also cares about a good life and about living well, and to have this intention. And we see the horrible results of war and violence break out when we don't trust each other. But I think, again, this is where we have a really amazing opportunity through congregations, through the work of committees. We have these places to practice trust, and we have these places to practice building it up. I collect all these ideas, and then I forget where they came from. But this is a quote or a perspective, and it's not my idea, which is what I want to say I've learned from it, is that one perspective about survival is be ruggedly independent, build your cabin in the woods, be self-sufficient, don't need anybody, and that's how you'll survive. But actually what it's going to take is we need community. When major disasters strike, that's where your ability to build strong and trusting relationships with your neighbors, with the people around you, that is key to survival. And I think that beyond, extreme situations, those are the skills we have to be practicing. And I would go back, Sandy, you brought the idea of safety into the conversation. How can people who have formal and informal leadership roles really work to build a sense of safety and belonging so that trust is possible?
I hate to say it, but I feel like learning to deal with conflict is probably in there somewhere. And learning to deal with it well, so that, because we are going to break each other's trust and we are going to hurt each other, and we're going to have to figure out how to do that well. Is there a chapter about conflict?
There's a little bit about conflict in the book, but it's really hard. For me, I feel like that's my Achilles heel, is being able to deal with conflict well, and not just deal with it well, but be in it without being consumed by stress and all of the health impacts that come from that. Somehow across, the whole realm of things, we have to be able to, I tell myself this in head knowledge, conflict can be generative. We need the clash of ideas and needs and perspectives and wants, because that surfaces what has to come out so that we can get to better, more creative solutions, ideas, ways forward. We need that conflict to get to good outcomes, and we have to be able to do it well.
You were talking before about establishing what is normal, and that, I think, figuring out what is normal will involve how is normal for when we're having a disagreement. And yeah, that starts really small with each of us.
So one of my insights lately that I've come to understand about the culture that I've been raised in, and a lot of the Mennonite church organizations and churches that I work in, is that harmony is seen as the goal, and that conflict is seen as a breakdown of harmony, and that's bad. And so the goal is return to harmony. But if conflict comes from different needs and perspectives surfacing that you need to surface to move through to better solutions, focusing on a return to harmony just maintains the status quo that isn't working for everybody. And so it becomes like this sacred thing, like, oh, well, something must be wrong because there's conflict, right? Or everything
When actually
is-
something's right if there's conflict, because it means you have different voices at the table, right?
Yes, and so it's very hard to change like ingrained feelings of, because I think that I probably need to talk to a therapist about this, or you, Sandy. Thank you. Right? Why in my body do I feel like something's wrong if conflict comes up, right? That's a physical response. But where did that come from that I'm trained to do that versus saying like, I am safe and it is okay and there are different needs and perspectives. Let's work through this so that we can, get to what's really important.
I think you should opt for the therapist because I don't have the answers. I'll do the same.
Other comments, questions? Disagreements? Well, it's getting close to 8, so I am going to suggest that we close the formal part of this. So Moses and then Sandy, is there anything that you want to close with before we mute your mics? I'm just kidding.
I'll go first. Well, I would encourage you to buy the book and read the book. And my hope is that there is space for the kinds of things we're talking about within the structures and institutions of the church that I'm a part of, right? Like that's for me personally. I don't know what groups or organizations or institutions you're a part of, but I hold my church structure and institution, not only local but wider, very dear to my heart. And that is where I find community. That is where I consider to have my family and all of that. And yet I struggle because I see that sometimes we uphold our institutions at the sake of our future, and we lose, or many people are losing trust in our institutions, like Marta is saying. So how can we even move forward with the structures that we have if so many people are saying, no, I'm out because we've broken trust? And so I'm hoping that this kind of grassroots rewilding that Leah's talking about, that we make space for that within our institutions. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think that's the kind of work that you are pushing us to. And so I appreciate your work in that.
Yeah, thanks for going first. I guess to go back to the idea of the fungal networks, I think one thing we need to remember is that those networks, that takes time to grow, and just because we have the idea of it doesn't mean that we'll be there tomorrow. And I think at least in my work, thinking about climate action, I get the question a lot, if I can't see a result tomorrow, why bother? And I think we as a church, it's good to look back, and I appreciated how the book sort of started with how do we tell our stories? We start what is past and we move to the future. And I think just seeing ourselves as nurturing this path, nurturing these networks, or feeding the mushrooms, whatever we want to say, it's slow work. Like, it's going to take a long time. And, what I model for my kids who are teenagers now is going to matter in how they enter their workforce and how they live in community and family. And so we can't just say, now it's like this, but it's going to have to grow. And I think there are places where the soil has been so disturbed that there are no networks. And so starting with strong networks really close to home and encouraging it broader, I feel like we just have to be patient and we have to have hope. And our faith is, we believe in miracles. God can bring life out of death. And what is more, hopeful than that? And so long work, slow work, and good work. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, I want to close by reading a little piece from the end of the book. Before I do that, I printed this off so I would actually remember to do it. But I write a newsletter called Imagining Change, and if you're here, you can scan this QR code, or I have a sign-up sheet, and maybe Arlen could link it in the for those online, where I write reflections. A lot of those reflections that I started with then turned into this book, and I haven't stopped having thoughts about the world. And so I continue to put that in the monthly newsletter there, so you can sign up for that to stay connected. And I also put events in there too. Next event, November 8th at my home church at Herb Street, retelling with a colleague, Clarence Katchigi, who is Cree and is involved in a lot of land-based healing work. And I'm really excited to talk about Waterloo region and stories and Mennonite and Indigenous perspectives and conversation. But I don't think that one is online. I think it is only in person. So sorry, Manitoba folks.
Just, we're going to fly out to Waterloo.
Yes, please do. It's going to be great. And I'll also be going to Saskatoon for the MCC Saskatchewan conference. So looking forward to that, and lots more ways of having great conversations like this. But I want to close from, comes from the very end of the book, of the epilogue. And this is from a letter to my daughter, Ava. The thing about seeds is you just don't know how they're going to grow, or even if they are going to grow at all. It takes care and tending and faith in the unseen magic of germination that happens in the dark. Some seeds, like birch tree seeds, need to experience a season of cold in order to sprout. Others can lay dormant for years until the right conditions unleash their potential. And some seeds seem to grow without ceasing, coming up in compost piles and sidewalk cracks, their enthusiasm to burst into the world unquenchable. Ava, as you grow up, you and your brother and your kindergarten classmates and your global generation of children born into this world in crisis, I hope the seeds of well-being, the seeds of liberation, of shalom for people and all creation can take root in your good soil. And I hope you find the courage and hope to plant seeds of your own. I know you can tend these seeds into something beautiful, something needed, something wild and flourishing to shape beautiful tomorrows.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Moses. Thank you, Sandy. Let's give them our appreciation. That closes the evening so well. I will leave my words on the sheet. Thank you. And thank you for coming. Thank you for participating. I'll open up the store momentarily. You're welcome to come buy a copy of Tending Tomorrow. It is available online at commonword.ca as well. Thank you. And good night, everyone.